Good afternoon. This is Deanne Lautenbach, and I see we have, oops, just like that. Technology is such a fun thing. I see we have participants joining us, joining the presentation today. Again, my name is Deanne Lautenbach from Center for Deafblind Persons. I welcome you all, and I hope that if you have attended our other webinars, you've enjoyed them, and I'm sure that you're going to enjoy today's webinar as well. Today we are introducing Marshall Flax, and he will be speaking on orientation and mobility. And I also want to make sure before we do that to do a little housekeeping with you. I do this all the time. If you want the captioning on, I'm going to ask you to take your mouse to the bottom of your page, and you will see live transcript or CC for closed captioning, and that will be at the toolbar at the bottom. You need to click on that to start your subtitles, and then once you do, you click on show subtitles on the little arrow to the right side, and the subtitles should come up for you on there. And once they do, you can grab that and move it around the screen where you need it to be. That being said, I'm going to let that go, and I'm going to let Marshall take over for now, and I'm going to just quietly leave the room. Please remember, if you are going to ask a question or anything like that, and you're using keyboards, you want to hit Alt-H for chat, and that's how you can access your chat. And I'm right now getting a comment from someone saying, I don't see the interpreter. So I am going to get out of here, and I am going to let you take over, Marshall.
Okay. Can you hear me? Making sure it's all still connected, right? Yes. Dina's saying yes. Interpreter says thumbs up. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. My name is Marshall Flax. I'm an orientation and mobility specialist. I'm actually retired, and as I say, I'm failing at retirement because I'm still working as an orientation and mobility specialist, but it's something I love to do. So I'm still happy doing it. We'll see if I get crankier as I get older. But today's talk is called "There and Back Again," taken from The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, because walking around when you can't see or can't see well is quite a quest, a journey can be. And there's a picture on the screen of Frodo with his stick, which I think was just his version of a cane. So I want you to know about, so my background is in blindness rehabilitation, not specifically deaf blindness. And really, when I was in school, we really didn't learn much about deafness or hard of hearing. So I'm going to tell you very much about the blindness rehab portion. And in this case, I'm really talking about services for adults. Children are served through the school districts, through the Department of Public Instruction, and they receive similar services, but today I'm just talking about adults. So when people lose vision, or it's discovered that they have impaired vision, often what they want to do is they ask, how can I get the most out of what I have, the vision that I have available to me? And they might see a low vision therapist. A certified low vision therapist is a CLVT. These are all certified by a group with an incredibly long name that I won't go into. So there's low vision therapist is one group of rehabilitation practitioners for visually impaired adults. And then there's the vision rehabilitation therapist, or CVRT. And this is a person who teaches activities of daily living to people who are blind or have low vision. One way to think of it, if you're in the medical field, is sort of like occupational therapy, but very narrowly focused, no pun intended, on blindness and vision rehabilitation. These are also the people, the CVRTs, who teach Braille to adults. Children get Braille in school, children who need or are eligible for Braille. But once you're after 21, there isn't much instruction out there, and it's the CVRT who can do that. Whoop, I went back.
On it.
So the low vision therapist, I'm sorry,
Still working.
my phone is talking to me. I hope that's not going to get in the way. I don't know why it's doing that. I probably said a name that
Something went
sounded
wrong.
like.
Please try again.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Siri. The orientation and mobility specialist, which is what I do, or certified O&M specialist, we teach people who are blind or visually impaired how to travel as independently, efficiently, and safely as possible. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that, or us, me, what we do. And finally, there's a fairly new certification available in assistive technology. Assistive Technology Instructional Specialist, or CADIS. And this is, as you might know or guess, there's a lot of technology out there. And it used to be, you could know a handful of apps. Well, back then they were called programs or software. And that was all there was to know. But now it's far more complicated between the apps and the hardware. And so you can actually get a certification in that. And I just want to point out, certification doesn't mean that you're fabulous at something. It just means that you actually know what you're doing or supposed to. As in the certification game, they say that person can jump over a 3-foot fence, the certified person. They might be able to jump over a 10-foot fence, but to be certified, you have to get over the 3-foot fence. Knowing a lot about technology or Braille or mobility is great, but if you don't have the broad view of the whole field, you may not be qualified to actually instruct somebody in how to do it. We all know people who know a lot about something and couldn't teach you how to do that, how to do what you need to do if your life depended on it. So that's what these professions do, is they teach you stuff, and they're supposed to know. We're supposed to know how to teach it. So O&M, orientation and mobility, wasn't always around. But so long as there's been more than one blind person, there's probably been one blind person teaching the other how to get around. Here's a painting from the mid-1500s by Peter Bruegel the Elder, called The Blind Leading the Blind. And it shows a group of about half a dozen men who appear to be blind or visually impaired, holding on to each other or each other's walking sticks. One of them's fallen down, the other is falling over him. It's not very pretty, but I think it probably gives us an accurate picture of how blind people might have gotten around in the Middle Ages, bonding together, perhaps for protection and support. We jump about 400 years up with this painting by John Singer Sargent called Gassed, which is a beautiful oil painting, but a horrible scene of hundreds of blind soldiers in World War I, British soldiers in this case, because of the widespread use of mustard gas and chlorine gas. So wars are obviously horrible, but because they have so many people of a similar age and disposition, in this case, young men, say 18 to 26, roughly, so many ending up with such similar medical, physical conditions, that there are often advances both in medicine and in rehabilitation. And so after World War I, dogs were being trained in how to guide blinded soldiers or blinded veterans, let's say, around. And this was in England. And there's some photographs that I found of dog guides in England in probably in the 1920s, guiding people who presumably were blind. So in 1923, a wealthy American named Dorothy Harrison Eustace, she's a dog breeder, dog trainer, really into dogs. She goes to a training center in Potsdam, Germany, and they're training dogs to guide blinded veterans, post-World War I blinded veterans. And she thinks this is great, and she studies what they do, and then she goes to Switzerland and opens up a school for training, a training center, and calls it the Seeing Eye. And in 1927, she writes a letter in the that's printed in the Saturday Evening Post. For those of you, and I assume it's most of you who are too young to remember magazines and the Saturday Evening Post, you might think of this as being the Facebook or the Instagram of its time. It was the way the nation communicated with itself through magazines that arrived usually monthly, let's say. And she writes this letter, and this young man from Nashville, Tennessee, named Morris Frank, contacts her and says, "Ms. Eustace, I'm blind. I think your idea of using dogs to guide people is great, and I want to do that." So Mr. Frank goes to Switzerland and he gets trained to use her dogs, and he comes back to Nashville in 1929, and he and his dog, his first dog was named Buddy, his second dog was named Buddy, his third, fourth, and fifth dogs were all named Buddy, but they had a number after their name. He has this dog and he can walk around independently. And there's a photograph here, there's two photographs, one of him standing on getting off a plane. When you walked downstairs and stood on the tarmac, there weren't jetways because there weren't even jets. And poor Buddy doesn't look too happy about going down these metal stairs. And then he's crossing a street with a dog, and there's 4 or 5 men in coats and hats and suits around him. And my read on this picture is they're going, "Oh my gosh, that blind man can walk and chew gum at the same time." Because back in the 20s, blind people didn't go anywhere independently. They either went, if they went anywhere, they were guided, led, dragged, pushed, and shoved by somebody else. Now, I'm speaking broadly here, but that's generally the way things were. You did not have people out with a white cane going down the street and crossing whenever they please. So here's Mr. Frank being guided by his dog, Buddy. It was quite a deal. Then along comes World War II, and we have another whole group of young, blind, or visually impaired men who all need rehabilitation. There's a picture here of Helen Keller speaking to a wounded veteran in a hospital bed. He's got a guitar, and she's with a soldier. I guess that's a soldier who has an eye patch over one eye. And World War II, just like World War I, brought the need for rehabilitation to the forefront, because there are just too many people to warehouse, too many people with all kinds of disabilities. So a man named Richard Hoover, who ultimately became an ophthalmologist, and in our field, he's called the father of the lightweight long cane technique. In 1944, Sergeant Hoover is at a treatment center for blind soldiers at the Valley Forge Army Hospital. A piece of trivia, the Department of Defense has its own hospitals like Walter Reed, or in this case, Valley Forge. And then there's the Veterans Hospitals, and they're separate medical systems. But he's at this Army hospital in Connecticut. I'm sorry, Valley Forge, that would have been in Pennsylvania. And he's at a staff meeting one day, and he says, talking about the people who are attending, the blind attendees, the soldiers, sailors, and airmen. People say blind people in this country do a good job of getting around. I don't think they do a good job I think they do a hell of a poor job. And this was sort of the shot heard around the world, although it wasn't really heard very far, but it was the big change for how blind people are the more orientational blind for orientation and mobility for people who are blind. So coming out of World War II, you had the Valley Forge Army Hospital, and they really emphasized teaching the use of a long cane. See, aluminum was invented, and they could make canes out of aluminum, and that was a big step forward because they weren't having to use heavy wooden canes all the time. And then there was another Army program, a rehabilitation center in Avon, Connecticut, and they weren't so big on the cane. They were big on using echolocation and sound shadows, where you can tell, fully hearing people can hear if there's, say, a wall present beside them or the absence of a wall, something like that. Russ Williams was a blinded veteran, and he actually went through both programs. And he ultimately sort of brought the best of both of those programs together and was appointed to be the director of the VA hospital in Hines, Illinois, the Hines VA. And that is just suburban Chicago. And that started just after World War II in 1947. So these are some pictures from Hines in the early days of blind soldiers, seamen, airmen, Marines, walking around with their canes, going through the cafeteria. And one of the hallmarks of Hines was they made it's the military. They made everybody do the same thing, no matter who you are or where you're from. Whether you came in there with you were a doctor who'd been blinded in World War II, you were going to learn to do the same thing as the guy who was a truck driver, let's say. And everybody learned everything, but they had a really good comprehensive rehabilitation program for the servicemen who were blind. Yep. The next step along the way, so thinking that's in the 40s and goes on through the 50s, by 1960, we had our first professional preparation program for orientation and mobility. And I lost track now, maybe about a dozen schools that can provide you with the training to earn your degree in orientation and mobility. Bucky Badger's down there on the lower right part of the screen. There's no longer a program in Wisconsin, but that program was up and running, and that's back when I went to school, and I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, and that's where I got my degree. Other logos on this screen include Pittsburgh, San Francisco State, Western Michigan. Western Michigan and Northern Illinois in DeKalb are the two closest programs to Wisconsin. University of Arkansas Little Rock has a big program, and Salus University, which used to be the Pennsylvania College of Optometry, they are in Philadelphia. They also have a big mobility program, O&M program, and low vision program and rehabilitation teaching program. They're quite big in the field. So now I'm going to talk about orientation and mobility. And I highlighted the little and sign between orientation and mobility because it really does comprise two somewhat separate and very distinct activities. But no matter what, orientation and mobility, our cardinal rules are we always teach one-on-one. I can't stand up in front of a class of 20 people and teach you all how to do mobility. We always teach in the real environment. You know, and this is not a knock on physical therapy, but if you've had physical therapy maybe, and you were in a clinic and they had a little set of stairs and you practiced walking up the stairs and walking back down and they were like 3 steps or something, and that was fine. I taught you how to walk upstairs. But in mobility, we're going to teach you on real stairs with with missing handrails or bad handrails or no handrails, stuff like that. And the full curriculum, from knowing nothing to being able to walk out of your house, catch a bus, transfer buses, go to a new place you've never been before, to have that much skill takes about 180 to 200 hours of instruction. I don't know anybody who ever gets that much instruction anymore. It certainly is possible, but it's just not anything I'm aware of. People just get little bits and chunks. So for people who are using canes, the technique is called the 2-point touch technique. And this is a pretty good picture of a man walking down the street with the cane centered in front of the midline of his body, and he's swinging the cane from left to right as he walks. The cane is measured to the height of the user. So I'm nearly 6'4", and my cane is much longer than someone who's 5'2". It's measured to an area called your xiphoid process, which if you feel your breastbone, where it stops being your breastbone and widens into ribs, that soft spot just at the bottom of your breastbone, that's called your xiphoid process. XYPHOID for anybody who's trying to spell this. And then you go a couple of inches above that, and that's supposed to be sized, that's supposed to make it so the cane tip lands where your foot's going to touch. The purpose of the cane is to preview the surface ahead of you. It is, some people think, I've had many people come up to me at parties and say, no, blind people just whack that cane on the ground to make a lot of noise so they can hear where they are. And no, some people might do that, but that's not the purpose of the cane. So it's to pick up changes in texture, changes in elevation, and particularly drop-offs like curbs or stairs. And the cane does a pretty decent job of protecting you from the waist down, but it does not protect you from the waist up. So branches, signs, things like that, you're still going to hit them, unfortunately. The cane is used 2-point touch. So you touch on the left, you touch on the right, and that movement is called your arc. And it should touch about 1 inch outside your shoulder lines. So if you project a line from your left shoulder and your right shoulder going straight out in front of you, you just need to go 1 inch or so beyond that. If you go a lot further, you're going to pick up a lot of information, and it's a lot of information that's not important most of the time, and you'll spend a lot of time trying to figure out what all that stuff is and getting your cane caught in chairs and tables and trees and sewer grates and all kinds of things. And the cane is supposed to come about 1/2 inch off the ground as it moves from left to right. So you're not bouncing real high, because if you do, it'll take too long for the cane to move from the left side to the right side. Just scanning the surface. If you drag it across the surface, you'll have lots of information. You'll have way too much information, and you'll snag or catch on every crack in the sidewalk. There are special techniques for activities like ascending or going up stairs. So the way you hold the cane so that you're able to tell when you're at the top stair. There's a special technique for descending stairs. So you'll know when you're almost at the bottom, and you can then use your cane safely. You won't be surprised by that step you didn't expect. And I'll go back and say, and there are specialty techniques for railroad tracks and revolving doors and all kinds of little things, but most of it is just good old 2-point touch. So the sequence for teaching mobility is in my fantasy example here, I'm working with someone who's never had any instruction, woke up blind this morning and said, I want to learn everything about mobility. So we'd start with indoor pre-cane skills, which is using a human guide. In my day in school, this was called sighted guide, but it's now called human guide. And I apologize that I just unconsciously slipped back and forth into sighted guide because I just had so many years of doing it, saying that phrase. But using another human who presumably has more vision than you do to be your guide by taking their arm and so on. And there's a whole technique for doing that so that you're as safe and as efficient as possible. Then we'd move to indoor cane travel, being able to detect obstacles, follow a wall, go up and down stairs, and then move to outdoor cane travel in a very quiet residential neighborhood where you learn how to detect drop-offs like curbs, how to do street crossings in quiet places. And I'll say here, crossing the street is not that hard. It's when you don't cross in a straight line, how do you figure out where you are and how do you get yourself back on the sidewalk and reoriented? That's where honestly, I spend most of my time in instruction with people. I'd say 80% of the time, you're not going to cross in a straight line. That's just my number that I make up, but I don't have research to support that. But it's that's fine. You can be off a few feet, but as long as you know what to do when you realize, oops, I'm not exactly where I plan to be. And then we just move into busier and busier neighborhoods. An area in mobility, we call it semi-business. You know, those areas in some cities where it's a little busier intersection. There's a few stores and shops, a restaurant or two, but then you get half a block away and it settles back down into residential. And then business areas, which are just all strictly business with no residential. And then finally, the use of public transportation, being able to get on and off a bus, find a seat, transfer buses, and so on. When an instructor is teaching somebody, we start out being side by side, right there with the client or student. And then gradually we distance ourselves. Now, this is not a game. This is not a mystery, not a surprise. I will say to my client, all right, you've done a nice job the last 2 lessons with this activity. Today, I'm going to be half a block behind you and watching you walk. So you're more on your own. And we do this so that the decision-making and the information processing falls more and more to the student or client. And they know that they can't just rely on me to reach out and grab them and keep them from falling off a curb. In fact, pretty early on, I will let you fall off the curb because, well, if you weren't using your cane the way you were taught, that's the price you pay. And that's a big part of mobility, is learning from your mistakes. And I promise you, once you've stepped off a curb by accident because you weren't using your cane properly, you will probably never do that again. I'm not talking about being injured. I'm just talking about a wake-up call and saying, oh my goodness, I see what he means about always doing this or doing that. It's not that I'm right. It's just that there's a technique that works and there are techniques that don't work. I might get to a point in a lesson where I'll say, gee, we've gone around the block a few times. Today, I want you to walk around the block and I'll just wait here for you. And some of this is part of the person being able to keep track and knowing when they've actually walked around the block. Because they might be so absorbed in not falling off the curb today that they lose track of how many turns they've made. And as I mentioned, this is all about learning from your mistakes in a guided, safe way. Now, there are lots of different canes out there. There's the rigid, mostly aluminum canes. They don't fold up. They're just one straight, narrow shaft of aluminum. There are canes that fold up. They have elastic shock cord in the middle that runs through the middle, so they can be folded up. And these are very, very popular. You can put them in your purse, put them in your briefcase, stick them in your coat pocket, even in your pants pocket for guys. Put them in a briefcase, something. You're getting in and out of an Uber. They fold up, get out of your way. And then canes that telescope, crunch, they slip together, and those are very popular too. Canes can be made of aluminum, which is probably the cheapest material. It's very strong. Fiberglass or graphite. Graphite makes great, super lightweight canes. They're very strong and quite expensive compared to aluminum cane might run you $25, $30. Graphite cane might run $75, just depending, just to give you some idea. And then there are also many, many cane tips. Back when I was in school, there was only one tip. It's called the pencil tip. It was just about a 2-inch piece of nylon, the same diameter as the cane, and it just stuck into the end of the cane, and that's what you got. But now they've made all different tips, different wheels and balls, things with ball bearings in them that can roll. On the upper left, there's a picture of, it looks like a Frisbee or a dog Frisbee, and that's actually what they started with. And this is for snow. The story was superintendent of the School for the Blind in North Dakota watched the kids in the school struggling to get out to the playground for recess in the winter. And their canes weren't being very helpful and came up with this idea, and it's now a snow tip. So it'll help glide over the snow. Far right, there's a picture of something that looks like a badly bent cane tip. And this was invented in South Africa for people who are never going to walk on a paved road or sidewalk, but they're going to walk in the bush a lot. And they need something that'll detect surfaces without poking into the ground and snagging all the time. It's almost the shape of a letter C. And these tips can either slip on or they hook into that elastic shock cord that runs into the middle of the folding canes. There are electronic canes. I can hear the wheels of the engineers, the quasi-engineers, the would-be engineers out there. Why don't they make an electronic cane? Well, they do. Every month I see something in my news feed about another group of engineering people who have come up with a cane to solve the mobility problems of the blind. But the one out there that's possibly the most popular among all of these canes is called the Ultra Cane. It uses ultrasonic technology, and it'll detect objects above, it'll detect drop-offs, and it'll detect objects in your way. And it vibrates and or makes a noise. Sometimes you need the vibration because the traffic noise around you is too loud to hear beeping and booping and that kind of thing. Excuse me. But you need special training as a mobility instructor to teach the use of this cane. And I've never received that training, and I've never been asked to teach this cane. I think they run about $1,000 a piece. So there's sort of a disincentive there, but they're on the market. You can Google them and take a look. So I mentioned that it's orientation and mobility, and we just sort of covered the mobility part. Now the orientation part, which in all honesty, that's the part I really love. The mechanics of mobility are great, but they're just mechanical skills. And if you're my student, I'll keep working with you to shape those to be as efficient and as safe as possible. But the thinking part, almost the chess game of where you are, where you're going, where you've been, is really, to me, the fun and the real challenging part. So what do we use for people who are blind or visually impaired so they can stay oriented to where they are? Well, landmarks. It might be, there's a particular type of combination of mailbox and fire hydrant and signpost on this corner, and I sort of know where I am anyway. And if I find all three of those positioned like I think they are, boom, that works. Or this building has a corner and there's a door and there's a carpet and it's a revolving door and boom, boom, boom. All these pieces link together and I know where I am. We encourage people, we try and teach people how to build mental maps. And this is for people who are congenitally blind, people who were born blind or never had vision. This is a real different process than for somebody who was fully sighted and then lost their vision. But trying to build a map and understand how all the landmarks are connected. Environmental cues. Maybe this is where I'm walking along and then I feel the sidewalk pitch downhill, or I get to this corner and, oh, gee, all the other corners in this neighborhood have ramps with truncated domes, the little bumps on them, but this one they never replaced yet. So it's got a drop off like an old fashioned curb. That would be a great environmental cue. And then we use cardinal directions, such as those are north, south, east, and west, which of course, if you're not versed in that, it'll drive you crazy. But your left is my right when we're standing and talking to each other. And sighted people are notorious for getting left and right backwards when they're talking to a blind person giving directions. They're also notorious for, they'll say it's the third door on the right, when really it's the fourth door. And that other door that's there that they never use, they just forgot all about it. But that's a whole separate story. So we use cardinal directions so we can talk about, oh, the north side of the street or the southeast corner of the intersection or something like that. What we don't use in mobility is counting steps. I've only seen this in the movies, and the only movie, it was a Disney movie. And it's one thing to say, yeah, when I get to this point, I turn right and I go 3 steps and bingo, there's the thing I'm looking for, 4 steps. In fact, if you're in an old-fashioned residential neighborhood and you walk up to the curb where the curb meets the gutter, where the sidewalk meets the gutter, and then you make a U-turn and come back 5 or 6 steps, you will be at the intersecting sidewalk in most cities in the Midwest. It's just 5 or 6 steps, count them off, and then you can go left or right or go back straight ahead. But we really don't use counting steps because you will forget what number you're on if you're counting more than 3, I promise you. Other sources of information are auditory information. And I'm sure that this is obvious for people who are deaf or people who are hard of hearing. We may not be able to rely on auditory information and may have to use other information. But for somebody with some amount of usable hearing, and given whatever, and under particular conditions, auditory information may be both useful and reliable. It's one thing to be able to hear something today, but will it always be auditorily accessible to you at different times of day or under different weather conditions? Learning to use direct sound or reflected sound. I sort of mentioned before, there's sound that reflects off of walls, both indoors and outdoors. People with average or better than average hearing can hear this sound. You don't really hear it as a sound, but more you're aware that there's a presence there. And then when you come past the edge of a building and where two streets intersect, that reflected sound goes away, and you go, oh, I don't even have to touch to see if I'm at the end of the building. I can hear that there's nothing there. We use tactile information, such as the texture of a sidewalk or anything else. Proprioceptive information, whether something's going uphill, downhill, leaning left, leaning right. Since about 75% of people who are legally blind in the US have some usable vision, sometimes we can use visual information. People with RP, retinitis pigmentosa, for example, may be able to see at night strings of the line of streetlights going down the sidewalk, or the line of oncoming headlights of the cars in the street as they walk down the sidewalk. But we can also use thermal and olfactory information, but it's not all that reliable. Thermal, like the sun on your skin. Yeah, if it's warm enough out or not too warm out or something, and you can tell where the sun is, or the smell of that bakery or that sub shop, that's great if the wind is not blowing the wrong way. So those are possibly usable, but they're literally on the bottom of this list because they're not the most reliable. And what everybody wants to know about are dog guides, because they look so good and they are really cool mobility devices. A dog guide generally spends its first year of life as a puppy with a puppy raiser. The Seeing Eye in Morristown, New Jersey, for example, there's only one Seeing Eye and they only have one campus. It's in Morristown. Their dogs they breed and raise their own dogs, but when they're puppies, then they go as a 4-H project to stay with a 4-H kid for a year, and they grow up in a house with food spilled on the floor and screen doors that slam on their tails and stuff like that. And then they're given back at about 14 months to the Seeing Eye, who then train them to be dog guides. A dog guide's service life is about 10 years, and then they get too old to walk fast or walk as fast as you do. And their hips tend to get bad. Dog guides are a tremendous social bridge. A blind person walking down the street with a cane, a group of sighted people standing there. Those sighted people usually get real quiet till the blind person walks by them, and then they'll start talking again. But if that same person's coming down the same street with a dog, everybody's saying hello. Oh, beautiful animal. What a lovely day, isn't it? What's your dog's name? And they're just increased social interaction among people. And sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes you're like in a hurry. You've got to be somewhere. And you don't want to be rude. And you also don't want people bothering or petting your dog. Dog guides are not maintenance free. They have to be groomed regularly because you don't want them shedding all over your friend's car. And you have to clean up after them when they poop. And there's a whole technique for how you locate your dog's poop and collect it in the plastic bag, similar to what sighted people do. The hardest part is now what do you do with your bag of dog poop? Because there aren't little beepers on the trash cans where you can dump it. That's another whole mobility problem we won't go into today. Dog guides come from specific schools. So dog guide is the generic term for a canine that guides someone who's blind. A seeing eye dog technically can only be a dog that comes from the Seeing Eye in Morristown, New Jersey. A leader dog is only a dog that comes from Leader Dogs for the Blind in Rochester, Michigan, and so on. No more than you could go to a very nice school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and call yourself a badger. Could you go to Guiding Eyes in Yorktown Heights, New York, and call yourself, say your dog was Seeing Eye? It just doesn't work that way. The number one rule for people who are not the dog owner is do not pet or feed the dog. You don't want to ruin the dog's behavior, and you don't want to disrupt the dog's diet because they need to pee and poop at the same time every day for the convenience of the owner who may have a job or a class or something and needs that dog's got to lie there and wait until 10:15 when the bell rings or it's break time before they can be taken out. And if you fed them something and their tummy's upset, that's not good. People always ask me, how does the dog know when the light is green and it's okay to cross the street? Well, the dog has no clue when the light is green and really doesn't know anything about crossing streets. The dog walks until it comes to a change in elevation, i.e. a curb, and then it stops because there's a change in elevation. That's what it's trained to do. And then it looks up at you and says, okay, Smarty, what do you want me to do now? Left, right, or forward? And you are the one listening to the traffic and going, oh, I know where I am and I want to cross the street. So I'll wait till I hear the surge of traffic that's parallel with me and I'll know that it's safe to go. And then I'll tell my dog to go forward. And the dog will go unless there's a bus or a car bearing down on them. And the dog will intelligently disobey your dumb command to go forward. But if you do that very often, the dog's training is going to break down. So to get a dog, you have to have mobility training with a cane first because the dog doesn't know how to cross the street. And if you don't know how to cross the street, then your life is going to, with that dog, is going to be walking around the same block all the time because you can't cross the street. Here are a couple of pictures of former students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The man at the top in the long white coat with all the other men with white coats is an MD, PhD. And he went through medical school at UW-Madison and got his dog, with his dog. And then the woman at the grand piano on the concert stage, she got her doctorate in, it's called musical pedagogy, that how to teach music. And she was from Korea, is totally blind, and came up with all kinds of cool ways to read musical scores as a blind person. So dogs are allowed anywhere and can go anywhere. But as a dog guide using friend of mine once said, people come up and say, well, your dog's just lying there. It's not doing anything. What's it good for? And she'll say, look around this very active, very busy room with lots going on and say, would your dog be able to lie there and not do anything? And I go, oh, I get it. That dog's trained to lie there and not do anything. So now a little bit about mobility for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. When I work with someone with a hearing impairment, in fact, for that matter, when I work with somebody with additional impairments beyond or other than vision, I have to adapt what I do. So that's what I'm doing with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Probably based on what their abilities and limitations are, we will work on decreasing the use of auditory information as a primary clue for mobility and orientation. Doesn't mean we'll say, well, you can't listen to the car, you can't tell what it is. You might have enough hearing to go, oh, I can hear all the traffic and I can hear that it's all going one way. So this is a one-way street, and I know there's only one one-way street in my neighborhood, so I know where I am now. I mean, it can be useful. It doesn't have to be very distinct hearing to be useful hearing. But we may also, depending on the extent of hearing impairment, increase the use of public assistance, especially for street crossings and at bus stops. And one technique that's used is the use of communication cards. And here is an example of a woman waiting to cross the street, and she's got a card. It's got a little diagram on it showing sort of two stick figures, one with a cane, one without, walking human guide. And it says, the card says in bold dark print, please help me cross Park Street. Tap me if you can help. I am hard of hearing and blind. And it says this on both sides so people can see it from either side, whichever way they're coming up to her. And she's a Braille reader, and she brailled it on this card, so she knows what it is. It's important to say which street you're trying to cross, because you might not be lined up perfectly, and someone, if you're at a four-way intersection, someone might think you're trying to cross that other street and take you across the wrong way. So you can stand there holding your card and wait for someone to tap you, and then you take their arm, you get across the street, you say, thank you very much, put your card away, and presumably, you know where you are and you know where you want to go until either you arrive at your destination or you get to the next point where you pull out your next communication card. Here are a couple of cards for riding the bus. One says, my stop is Linden at Charter. Please let me know when number 80 arrives. Tap me if you can help. I'm hard of hearing and blind. Another one says, my stop is Eagle Heights, Lot E. Please let me know when number 80 or 84 arrives. So you could be waiting. This person was waiting for her bus with this card out. And when we rode the bus together, and I sat some distance from her so she could do this in real time with real people who didn't know she was on a lesson, I noticed that many people on the bus, if she had her card out, were all reading her card. It was sort of sitting on her lap with, on top of her purse. She had it positioned so everybody walk by could see it. So someone might just feel in the mood at that moment to tap her and say, oh, we're here at Eagle Heights Lot E. Tap her, and she would get up, take their arm, and they can get off the bus together. She's already shown this to the bus driver, so hopefully the bus driver is remembering this, and he or she will let the passenger know. But other passengers can be pulled into this if you're careful. A couple of other signs, a large number 84. This is so that we catch the bus driver's attention as he or she pulled up, and maybe he or she, if no one pedestrian or no other bus driver was around to help the traveler, the bus driver might be able to get off the bus and escort that person onto the bus. Keeping in mind that person's already had instruction on once you're on the bus, how do you pay your fare? How do you find a seat? All that stuff. That's not the job of the Good Samaritan traveler or the bus driver. There's a great hour-long video webinar, really, on at Helen Keller National Center, all about using communication cards. And if you just go the communication cards for community interactions at Helen Keller National Center, it's yours. It was really good. So to conclude, orientation mobility is for people with travel difficulties. As you know now, it was developed primarily for people with vision impairment. But many people with vision impairment have other disabilities. And so people in my field learn to work with people who are not only blind or visually impaired, but have other disabilities, motor disabilities, cognitive disabilities, things like that. And of course, hearing impairment. What we do, I guess I can't say this is what we're supposed to do. It's certainly what I do. I try and maximize one of the client's strengths and then find ways or supports or workarounds for the things that aren't doing so good. And I hope that doesn't sound too crude, but if my client can't hear well, I'm going to plan the route or the technique that relies far more on tactile aids than on hearing. And I explain this. This is no mystery. I'm not doing anything behind the curtains here. Explaining to the client, gee, that doesn't seem to be a good way for us to work on this. How about if you follow the building line here with your cane, and when you get to the end, you'll do this, and then you'll do that, and that'll put you in the place where you want to be, instead of relying on your hearing that's maybe not that reliable. So it's all about tailoring it to what the person's abilities are and what their limitations are. And I'll stop there. And here's Bilbo saying goodbye and thank you very much.
Marshall, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I want to take a minute. I can see we got a couple of hand claps coming up in our emojis. If there are any comments or questions anyone would like to take a moment, we will give you that. I know that for some, like I said before, if you'd like and do use your keyboard, Alt-H will get you to the chat so that you're able to type in any questions. Again, we're getting our clap emojis. Okay. And I'm glad hey, emojis, that's our communication mode here. It's perfect.
A Saturday evening post of 2022, I tell you.
Exactly.
I'll say one thing. I don't know if I sort of expected the question. Well, gosh, that orientation and mobility sure sounds swell, Marshall. How can I get trained to do that? It costs money, of course, like everything else, and it's not reimbursed by Medicare and Medicaid. But I would say contact either or both, depending on who your provider is, the Wisconsin Office for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and there's somebody who's covering everybody in the state. There's like half a dozen folks who work for the Office of the Blind or Visually Impaired. Mm-hmm. Or if you're working age and you have a DVR counselor and you need mobility related to work or school, that's something that typically DVR, the Wisconsin Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, pays for. I can't spend their money for them, but those are a couple of resources that I can think of right off. And if you're a kid, if you're under 21, it should be coming through your school district.
All right. Again, thank you. I do not see any questions. A quick thank you from Joan Schneider. And thank you from me, Marshall. This was wonderful. I know that I learned a lot today, and I'm sure that our listeners did as well. And I'd also like to a quick thank you to our captionist and our interpreter. And with that, I'm going to end this since we have no questions.